Good morning. So we started this database after we were involved in Yasin Arif's case, and we started realizing that there were other cases around the country that were also unfair. We kind of gradually started realizing this. And then the Department of Justice came out with this list of about 400, actually 399 cases that it said were convicted terrorists in the United States. And they actually said that to try to justify closing Guantanamo, which is great. But then they said, well, we're really good at convicting terrorists in U.S. domestic courts. We convicted 400 terrorists. And we saw that Yasin Arif's name was on the list, and we know he's not a terrorist. So basically we started looking at all these other cases. And only 4 out of those 399 people actually planned or attempted any acts of violence in the United States without the involvement of a government provocateur. And fully 289 of the 399, or 74%, were cases of what we call preemptive prosecution. And we define preemptive prosecution as a law enforcement strategy developed after 9/11 to target and prosecute people whose beliefs or religious affiliations raise security concerns for the government. And often the actual charges used are pretexts. The government is suspicious about somebody because of their beliefs or religion and decides to go after them for other reasons, set them up in a sting operation or use some kind of charges to go after them, whatever they can come up with. And preemptive prosecution is characterized by the disparity between how people of certain groups, religious groups, or with certain ideologies are treated versus the general public. The general public doesn't get, they don't try to go after certain groups and for sting operations, but they do for other groups. Journalist Chris Hedges has said that preemptive prosecution mocks domestic law as readily as preemptive war mocks international law. And I think there's a lot of similarities there. So 74% of the cases that they call terrorists were what we call pure preemptive prosecution cases. Another 87 of them, or 20%, were what we call elements of preemptive prosecution, where there's some real crime going on, often a fraud crime or something like that, and the government was suspicious of the people, and so they called it a terrorist case, or they added terrorist-related charges that didn't really fit. So if you add the pure preemptive prosecution plus the elements of preemptive prosecution, that adds up to 376 of the 399 cases, or 94%. And we'd say that there's only 6% of those cases that were not preemptive in some way. And again, only 4 people were actually planning acts of violence in the U.S. without a provocateur being involved. There's the kinds of charges that they use, sting operations, which Yasin Arif's case was, and another case, a lot of cases, but Tariq Shah, whose mother lives here in Albany, was also set up in an unfair sting operation. His mother's actually here today, Marlene Jenkins, and he's serving a 15-year sentence, as is Yasin Arif. There's also material support to terrorism charges that are used, and they were used in a third of the cases. And that charge does not require any intent to support violence. It just requires some sort of support to what the government calls a designated terrorist organization, and it can be purely nonviolent. For example, the Holy Land Foundation case, people were convicted of material support to terrorism for giving nonviolent equipment for schools and hospitals in Gaza, and had no intent to aid any violence, and didn't even give this material to a designated terrorist organization, but to what are called zakat committees. But because they were said to be controlled by Hamas, and there wasn't even proof of that, these people were convicted of material support and are serving 65 years, sentences like that. So material support charges have been used in an extremely unfair way. There's also charges where people were convicted of what should be First Amendment protected activity, such as running a website where people may say things against the government, but it's not actually planning violence. That's supposed to be First Amendment protected activity. So it's 40% of cases are either vague conspiracy charges or First Amendment protected activity. Another 16%, well actually 19% of all the cases, sorry I got a bunch of different statistics here, another 19% are false statements charges, which are just where the FBI interviews somebody and decides that they said something that's not true, or that it's called a false statement, and this has been abused. And actually, very interestingly, the FBI just changed their policy where they're requiring the person now know that saying something not true to the FBI is a crime. They didn't used to have to prove that the person knew that it was a crime. And also, they started recording their interrogations, which they never used to do. They just very recently started that. That was one of our recommendations, which Steve Down's going to talk about our recommendations. There's also a bunch of people who were charged with immigration, like minor immigration violations, such as not reporting a prior marriage, something totally non-terrorism related, but soon after 9/11, the government was suspicious of a lot of Muslims and charged them with these minor immigration violations, and they ended up on the terrorist list too. Now, you may say, well, this is, not a huge number of people. Maybe some people were unfairly convicted, but why does this matter? Well, it matters to us because, we care about these people, we know their families. But aside from that, in the bigger picture, I think it really matters because the threat of Muslim terrorism is used to justify a lot of abuses that this country is engaged in. And so showing that that threat is actually much smaller than the government claims, I think, is pretty important. It's used to justify, of course, wars, including wars in places like Yemen and Somalia where there is no declared war, and they are just using drone attacks and killing lots of people, including many innocent civilians. It's used to justify mass surveillance of all of us, right? All of our phone calls, emails, our faces, are all collected and stored by the government for whatever purpose they want to use it for. And when you say, well, why are you doing this? Oh, we need to do this because it's a dangerous world and there's a huge threat from Muslim terrorists, basically how they justify a lot of things. And of course, secret evidence, too, is used in many of these cases. And you find that that is starting to spread into regular cases, too. There's sort of this aura of secrecy that's increasing more and more from the government. And any of these tactics that they use against the Muslims tend to spread and be used against other people, too. So that's another reason why this matters. They're starting to use some sting operations, the same kind of tactics against non-Muslim groups that they want to go after, which, if they're going to do it, it shouldn't be just Muslims, but they really shouldn't be doing it at all because it's very unfair to just use a provocateur and kind of convince vulnerable people to do something. So, this is not really new, that there's been abuses like this in the past where various bogeymen have been used by the government to get people to support various repressive measures. It's happened, with McCarthyism. It happened a lot of times in the past, COINTELPRO. But we need to be aware that it's happening now, and I think this report is a step in that direction to show that, they're saying what they're saying about these cases is just not true. It doesn't hold up. So Steve's going to talk about the recommendations in our report.